In 1848, a self-taught engineer named John Bloomfield Jervis finished a piece of work that sounds like something out of the Roman Empire rather than out of New York. He carried a river across the sky. To bring clean water to a city that was dying of thirst and burning down for the lack of it, he ran an artificial river 41 miles by gravity alone, and where a wide tidal river called the Harlem stood in the way, he did not go around it and he did not go under it. He carried his river over the top of it, on a line of stone arches more than 100 feet in the air. They called it the High Bridge. It is the oldest bridge still standing in the city of New York, and almost nobody who walks across it today knows what it was actually built to do. I have been reading the old reports of the Croton Aqueduct and the eyewitness accounts of the men who built it, and as always, I want to start with the names the record actually kept, because the thousands of men who cut and set the stone were mostly never written down at all. The first name is John B. Jervis. He was born in 1795 on Long Island, and his family moved up to the town of Rome in central New York when he was a small boy. He had almost no formal schooling in engineering, because in his day there was almost none to be had in America. He learned the trade the way the best of that first generation learned it, out on the line of the Erie Canal. In 1817, when the Erie Canal was first being dug across the middle of New York State, Jervis hired on as an axeman, the lowest job there was, swinging a blade to clear brush and trees out of the canal's path. He worked under a man named Benjamin Wright, who is often called the father of American civil engineering. And Jervis climbed. From axeman he became a rodman, holding the measuring rod for the surveyors. From rodman, he became a resident engineer in charge of a 17-mile stretch of the canal. By the time he was in his late 20s, he was running an entire division of the greatest public work in the country. The Erie Canal was his university, and he graduated from it knowing how to move water. The second name is Fayette Tower. Fayette Bartholomew Tower was a young assistant engineer who joined the Croton Aqueduct staff in 1837 and stayed on it through the whole construction. He matters to this story for a reason most engineers do not. He wrote it down. In 1843, while the work was still going on, Tower published a book called Illustrations of the Croton Aqueduct, 21 plates with text, drawn from sketches he made on the job for his own satisfaction. He said plainly that he had been in the engineer department during the entire construction of the aqueduct. That book is the closest thing we have to a camera carried through the whole project. And a great deal of what we know about how this thing was actually built comes from a young man who simply wanted to remember what he had seen. These two are our anchors. Jervis, the canal man who designed it. Tower, the young engineer who witnessed it and left us the record. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. To understand why a city would spend a fortune and a decade carrying a river across the sky, you have to understand how bad the water situation in New York actually was, because it was not an inconvenience. It was killing people. In the early 1800s, New York City drank from shallow wells and from a foul pond on the lower part of the island. Water that was already being fouled by the privies and the tanneries and the slaughterhouses of a growing town. The water was so bad that many people drank beer and cider instead, and the water carted around the streets in barrels for sale was expensive and often filthy. Filthy water in a crowded city does what it always does. In 1832, a cholera epidemic swept through New York and killed more than 3,500 people in a matter of weeks, in a city of only a couple 100,000. People who could afford to flee the city did, and the ones who stayed watched their neighbors die of a disease that traveled in the water they had no choice but to drink. And then there was fire. A city built largely of wood and brick, packed tight, with no clean water under pressure to fight a blaze, is a city waiting to burn. In December of 1835, in the dead of a brutally cold winter, a fire broke out in the heart of the downtown business district. The cold had frozen the wells and the cisterns, the firefighters could not get water, and the fire ate something like 700 buildings, a quarter of the commercial heart of New York, before it finally stopped. Men stood in the snow and watched the richest blocks of their city burn because they had nothing to throw on it. Between the cholera and the Great Fire, the argument was over. New York had to have a real water supply, a clean one, a big one, and one that arrived under its own power, and the city finally voted to go and get it. The water they decided to take came from the Croton River, up in Westchester County, more than 40 miles north of the city. The plan, in the end, was as old as Rome, and as bold as anything attempted in America to that point. They would dam the Croton River to make a reservoir, and from that reservoir they would build an enclosed masonry aqueduct, a covered stone channel, that would carry the water all the way down to Manhattan by gravity alone. It used no pumps and no steam engines, just a long, gentle, continuous downhill slope, dropping only about a foot every mile, so slight that the water would walk downhill to the city on its own and never stop. 41 miles of hand-built channel, holding its grade across every valley and every ridge and every river in its path. It is worth saying how Jervis came to run the project at all, because he was not the first choice. The first chief engineer of the Croton Aqueduct was a West Point professor named David Bates Douglas, who surveyed the route, drew up the first plan, and estimated the whole 41-mile system would cost around $4.75 million. But Douglas moved slowly. The commissioners lost patience, and in October of 1836, they dismissed him and handed the work to Jervis, the canal man, who finished the design and drove the thing to completion. The aqueduct we are talking about is, in that sense, two men's work, surveyed by a professor and built by a former axeman. Picture the channel itself, because most people imagine a pipe and it was nothing of the kind. The Croton Aqueduct was a masonry tunnel built mostly near the surface of the ground, shaped like a horseshoe, about 7.5 feet wide and 8.5 feet tall, big enough for a man to walk through standing up. It was laid up out of stone and brick and hydraulic cement, plastered smooth on the inside so the water would run freely, then covered over with 3 or 4 feet of earth to keep it from freezing in the New York winter. That horseshoe channel could carry as much as 90 million gallons of water a day. To hold its gentle grade across the broken country of Westchester, the builders drove 16 tunnels through the hills, the longest more than 1,200 feet, and threw up more than 100 culverts and arches to carry the channel over the streams in its path. Near the town of Ossining, the old Sing Sing, they built a stone arch with an 88-foot span to leap the creek called the Sing Sing Kill. It all began at a great dam on the Croton River, about 250 feet wide and 55 feet high, which backed the river up into a reservoir 5 miles long, holding 500 million gallons. Everything about it was big, and almost all of it was built by hand. That dam very nearly ended the whole project before the water ever reached the city. In the first days of January 1841, while the dam was still being finished, 1.5 feet of snow lay on the ground and the temperature suddenly shot up, and 3 days of warm rain came down on top of the melting snow. The Croton River rose and rose, and in the early morning hours of the 8th of January, the water overtopped the earthen embankment of the unfinished dam and tore it open. A wall of water, ice, and debris went down the Croton River Gorge, rising as much as 50 feet in the Narrows, sweeping away every bridge on the lower river and killing 3 people before it emptied into the Hudson. The damage ran to $700,000. The men rebuilt the dam stronger, with a heavier embankment and a curved profile shaped to take a flood, and that rebuilt dam held until 1906. But the Great Freshet of 1841 is a reminder that this was not a tame project. They were damming a real river, and the river fought back and won the first round. And think about the surveying alone. To make water flow the whole 41 miles without a single pump, the channel had to fall at a perfectly controlled, almost imperceptible grade, only about 13 inches of drop in every mile. Too steep, and the water would run too fast and scour the channel apart. Too flat, and it would stand still and turn stagnant. The engineers had to hold that 13-inch per mile slope across rivers and ridges and valleys, mile after mile, using nothing but surveyor's levels, measuring rods, and chains, the same simple instruments Jervis had first carried as a young rodman on the Erie Canal. Get the grade wrong by a little over a long enough distance, and the whole river of water would refuse to move. They did not get it wrong. And the hardest place on the whole route, the place that could have broken the entire idea, was the Harlem River. Let me explain why one river crossing was the crux of the whole thing, and join me at the boss tier while I do, for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to the river in the way. Here is the problem the Harlem River posed. The aqueduct lived or died on its grade, that continuous, gentle downhill slope. Break the grade, force the water to drop down into a valley and then somehow climb back up the other side. And gravity stops working for you. The water would pool at the bottom and go no further. So when the channel reached the wide valley of the Harlem River, between what is now the Bronx and the upper end of Manhattan, the engineers could not simply dip the aqueduct down to the water and back up. They had to carry the water across that whole valley at height, holding the grade the entire way. On top of that, the Harlem was a navigable tidal waterway, and the state of New York had written into the law that the crossing could not block boats. The aqueduct had to cross either as a tunnel deep under the river or as a bridge standing at least 100 feet above the high water, tall enough for the masts of ships to pass beneath. Jervis weighed a tunnel and weighed a low bridge, and in the end he chose the boldest answer, the high bridge. He would carry the water across the Harlem Valley on a line of great stone arches, like a Roman aqueduct lifted into the modern age. The structure he built, the high bridge, ran about 1,450 feet from end to end, the better part of a third of a mile, on 15 stone masonry arches. 8 of those arches, the ones over the deepest part of the crossing, spanned 80 feet each. The other 7 spanned 50 feet each. The whole line of stone stood roughly 140 feet above the river at its highest, with the central arch giving 114 feet of clear air above the high water for the ships. And buried inside that bridge, hidden from anyone looking up at it, ran the iron pipes that actually carried the Croton water across. The bridge was beautiful, but the beauty was almost a side effect. It was a machine for keeping water at the right height. Now think about what building that meant in the 1840s, because this is the part that still stops me. There were no cranes worth the name. There were no powered tools. The granite was cut by hand and hauled into place, block by block, and the piers had to be sunk down into the bed of a tidal river. To build a stone pier in a river, the men had to wall off a section of the riverbed with a temporary dam, what the engineers called a coffer dam, then pump and bail the water out of the enclosure, dig down to solid footing, and lay the stone up from the bottom while the river pressed against the walls trying to get back in. They did this in the open, exposed to the tide and the weather, with hand pumps and shovels and muscle. Every one of those 15 arches stands on foundations that men dug out of a living river by hand. The contract for the bridge was let in August of 1839, and the water did not flow across it until the 30th of May, 1848. Nearly 9 years on one bridge. And the cost of that single structure came to $963,427.80, which in the 1840s was an immense fortune. And while the Great Bridge slowly rose, the city could not wait for it. The aqueduct reached the north bank of the Harlem years before the High Bridge was finished, so the engineers ran the water across the river in the meantime through an inverted siphon, a low pipe that dipped down across the riverbed and let the water's own pressure push it up the far side. It worked, but a siphon like that loses force and cannot carry the full flow, and everyone understood it was a stopgap. The real crossing, the one that would hold the grade and carry the full river of Croton water for a century, was the line of high stone arches. The granite was cut and dressed by hand and set by masons working from timber, scaffolding more than 100 feet above the water. Course by course, arch by arch, each of the 15 arches closed with a keystone at the top. There was no room for error 140 feet up. A bridge that carries water cannot sag and cannot leak, or the whole 41-mile system fails at the one point where it crosses the river. And here is where I have to talk about the men who actually did it, because the records are very clear about who they were and very silent about who they were. The labor on the Croton Aqueduct was done largely by Irish immigrants, 3,000 to 4,000 of them at a time strung out along the 41 miles, men who had come to America fleeing hunger and were willing to do the hardest, most dangerous work in the country for about $1 a day. They dug the channel, they cut the stone, they sank the piers, and they died in cave-ins and blasting accidents that the record barely bothers to count. They lived in rough shanty camps that moved along the line as the work moved. In the summer of 1838, they went on strike for that dollar a day, marching down the line. And in 1840, they struck again, and the mayor sent mounted militia up to break it. These were not soft men, and this was not gentle work. They built a Roman aqueduct across the modern landscape of New York with their hands, and the ledger gives most of them no name, only a number and a daily wage. When people say New York got its first clean water in 1842, what they are really saying is that several thousand Irish immigrants dug it a channel 41 miles long and then mostly vanished from the history. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old engineering stories like this one unless enough people click. One click and then come right back, because I want to show you what happened when the water finally arrived. The aqueduct itself, the long channel down from the Croton Dam, was finished first, and the water reached Manhattan in the summer of 1842, even though the high bridge that carried it across the Harlem was not yet done. When they finally opened the gates at the Croton Dam on the 22nd of June, 1842, the water took about 22 hours to travel the 41 miles down to the city, walking the whole way on nothing but its own gentle downhill grade. For those first years, it crossed the Harlem on the temporary low siphon while the Great Bridge was still rising. And when the Croton water finally came into the city, New York threw a celebration the likes of which it had rarely seen. On the 14th of October, 1842, there was a parade miles long, cannon fire, church bells, and fountains turned on for the first time, throwing clean, cold mountain water 50 feet into the air in the middle of a city that a decade earlier had been drinking from a poisoned pond. People wept at the sight of a fountain. A poet wrote an ode. To understand that reaction, you have to remember the cholera and the fire. These people had watched the water kill them and watched the lack of water burn them, and now here was clean water, more than they could use, arriving by the power of gravity from 41 miles away. It must have looked like a miracle. It was actually engineering. When the Croton water came down the west side of Manhattan, it first filled a vast holding basin called the Receiving Reservoir, a rectangular lake of water inside fortress walls that stood where the great lawn of Central Park is today, between what are now 79th and 86th Streets, more than 1,800 feet long and over 800 feet wide, holding as much as 180 million gallons. From there, the water ran down to the distributing reservoir on Murray Hill at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, where the New York Public Library and Bryant Park stand today. That reservoir was one of the wonders of the city, a great stone tank behind granite walls 50 feet high and 25 feet thick, built with a heavy sloping face in a vaguely Egyptian style, so massive that New Yorkers used to walk along the top of its walls as a promenade to look out over the rooftops. From that reservoir, the water ran out through the pipes into the streets and the homes and the new fountains of the city. For the first time, New York had water to drink that did not carry disease, water under enough pressure to fight a fire, water to bathe in and to wash the streets with. The cholera that returned in later years had far less to feed on. It is hard now to feel how large that change was, because clean running water is the most invisible thing in a modern city. But consider what it meant in 1842. A family that had bought its water by the bucket from a cart or hauled it from a fouled well could now have it run into the house. The fire companies that had stood helpless in the snow in 1835 now had hydrants fed by a 41-mile river. Public baths became possible. Real street cleaning became possible. The death rate from the water-borne fevers that had haunted the crowded wards began, slowly, to fall. New York had been a dangerous place simply to take a drink, and within a few years of the Croton water arriving, it was measurably less so. None of that showed up as a single dramatic moment. It showed up as people quietly not dying of the things that used to kill them, which is about the highest thing a piece of engineering can ever do, and the hardest to notice. A single act of engineering had quietly changed what it meant to live in that city, and at the heart of the whole system, holding the grade across the one valley that could have stopped it, stood the high bridge. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. The bridge itself went on to have a long and strange life, and I want to tell it honestly, because the high bridge you would see today is not exactly the one Jervis finished. For its first decades, it was both a piece of vital infrastructure and one of the most beloved public places in New York. In 1864, a walkway was added along the top, and the high bridge became a promenade, a place where New Yorkers strolled high above the Harlem River to take the air and look out over the water and the growing city. In 1872, they raised a tall octagonal granite tower at the Manhattan end, the High Bridge Water Tower, about 200 feet high, holding a great tank that helped push the water up to the higher neighborhoods that the gravity grate alone could not reach. Families came up to the bridge on a Sunday the way they would later go to a park. For a New Yorker of the 1870s, the High Bridge was not an antique. It was the modern marvel that kept their taps running and gave them the finest view in the city. Then the city grew past it, and the river traffic grew with it. By the early 20th century, shippers complained that the line of stone arches, beautiful as it was, crowded the navigable channel of the Harlem River. There was a serious proposal to tear the whole bridge down. New Yorkers fought to save it, and in the end a compromise was struck that I have to be square with you about. In 1927 and 1928, the 5 stone arches that crossed the actual river channel were taken down and replaced with a single long steel arch, around 400 feet of steel, to open up the water for the boats. So, when you look at the High Bridge now, you are looking at stone arches over the land on either side and a single steel arch over the water in the middle. The bulk of Jervis's masonry still stands, the oldest in the city, but the part directly over the river is 20th century steel. I would be lying to you if I said it was all original stone, and the truth is interesting enough without the exaggeration. The Croton water stopped flowing across the bridge in 1958, when a newer and far bigger water system had long since taken over the job. The old promenade fell into disuse, and the bridge was closed off by the early 1970s, and for more than 40 years the oldest bridge in New York stood empty and locked, rusting quietly above a river most people had stopped thinking about. And then the city came back to it. After a restoration costing tens of millions of dollars, the High Bridge reopened on the 9th of June, 2015, this time purely as a footbridge, a park in the air, and New Yorkers walked across it again for the first time in nearly half a century. The river it was built to carry no longer runs across it. The people do. The reservoirs went the way of the bridge, only further. The Great Receiving Reservoir up in what became Central Park was drained and filled in around the turn of the 20th century, and the Great Lawn, where New Yorkers now spread blankets and watch concerts on a summer night, sits directly on the bed of the old Croton holding basin. The distributing reservoir down at 42nd Street, the one with the 50-foot Egyptian walls that people used to walk along, was pulled down around 1900, and on its footprint the city raised the New York Public Library, with Bryant Park behind it. Stand on the library steps today, between the 2 stone lions, and you are standing on the spot where the Croton water once pooled before it ran out into the streets. The water system that saved the city has very nearly vanished into the city it saved. The dam was replaced, the reservoirs were filled, the long conduit was abandoned, and most of the famous stonework is gone. The one great piece still standing, still where Jervis left it, is the High Bridge over the Harlem. As for the 2 men, their later lives ran in very different directions. Fayette Tower, the young engineer who left us the eyewitness book, did not have long. He died back home in Waterville, New York, in 1857, only 39 years old. But his illustrations of the Croton Aqueduct survived him, and it is still one of the best windows we have into how the thing was actually built. A young man's careful drawings outliving the young man by more than a century and a half. John Jervis lived a long life and built a great deal more. The man who started as an axeman on the Erie Canal went on to build other water systems, other railroads, and other canals, and he became one of the most respected engineers in the country. He helped bring water to Boston, as he had to New York. He worked on railroads and designed a locomotive with a swiveling front truck that helped trains take sharper curves, an idea that spread across American railroading. He lived until 1885 and died at 90 years old, back in Rome, New York, the same town his family had moved to when he was a boy, having spent his whole life learning to move water and iron and then teaching the country how to do it. A small city up on the Delaware River, Port Jervis, still carries his name today. And the bridge stayed. The cholera that drove them to build it is gone. The Great Fire is a footnote. The fountains they wept over are long since ordinary. Jervis is gone and Tower is gone, and the 3,000 to 4,000 Irishmen who cut and set the stone are gone, with hardly a name among them. But the High Bridge is still up there above the Harlem, the oldest bridge in New York City. The stone arches Jervis raised, still standing on the foundations that nameless men dug out of a tidal river by hand. It carried a river across the sky for 110 years, and now it carries people, and either way it is doing what a bridge is supposed to do, which is to get something across a gap that ought to have stopped it. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We name the disasters that build cities. We remember the cholera of 1832 and the Great Fire of 1835, and we remember the engineer, John Jervis, who answered them. But the thing that actually answered them was not a disaster, and was not a single famous man. It was 41 miles of hand-cut channel and one impossible bridge, built by thousands of men whose names nobody bothered to keep. We say, New York was saved by clean water. I think it is more honest to say New York was saved by the Irishmen who carried that water across the sky on their backs, one block of granite at a time, and then disappeared from the story they made possible. They never got a monument, and most of them never got a stone with a date carved on it. But the bridge they raised is the oldest of its kind, still standing in the largest city in America. And to me, every arch of it reads like a marker set over the men the record forgot. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.